World War II was the biggest war in history. More people fought in it, died in it, and wrote about it than any other. We have official records, we have battle plans, and government documents. But the real story is in the small papers. The diaries kept in secret, the notebooks filled under candlelight while bombs fell. These weren't written for us, they were written for the self, for a future that might not come. They are honest in a way official history can never be. Between 1939 and 1945, over 100 million people were put into military uniform. But what about the billions who were not? The mothers, the children, the factory workers, the farmers. What did they think when they heard the radio announcer's grave voice? How did it feel to see the sky filled with foreign planes? We have the numbers. We know that around 75 million people died, but a number is just a number. It's a statistic. A diary entry is a human being. It's the story of one of those 75 million. This is a look at 25 of those stories. Told in their own words or as close as we can get. They come from all sides, from every front. They show us that behind the uniforms and the flags, people were just people. They were scared, they were brave, they were hungry, they were in love, they were losing hope and finding it in the strangest places. These entries don't tell the story of the war, they tell the story of people trying to live through it, and that might be the most important story of all. Number 25. Can you get used to the sound of bombs? Nella Last lived in Barrow-in-Furness, a shipbuilding town in northern England. She was a middle-aged housewife. She felt her life was small and unimportant. In 1939, an organization called Mass Observation asked ordinary people to keep diaries. They wanted to create an anthropology of ourselves. They wanted to know what people really thought and felt, away from the government propaganda. Nella started writing, and she didn't stop. Her diary became one of the most detailed accounts of life on the British home front. On September 9th, 1940, the German air raids on British cities, known as the Blitz, had just begun in earnest. London was the primary target, but the fear was everywhere. Nella wrote about the sound, the wail of the air raid siren. She called it a banshee, a sound that made your blood run cold. She described the unreal feeling of waiting for the bombs to fall. She wrote about her neighbor, a young woman with a new baby. The woman was shaking. She couldn't stop. She kept saying, what if they hit us? What about the baby? Nella tried to comfort her. But in her diary, she admitted her own fear. She wrote about the strange calm that came after the all-clear siren, a feeling of borrowed time. She wondered if a person could ever get used to it. The constant threat, the idea that your house, your street, your life could be gone in a flash. Nella's diary, later published as Nella Last War, is so powerful because it's not about grand strategy. It's about the price of eggs. It's about mending old clothes because you couldn't buy new ones. It's about the small acts of kindness between neighbors. Her entry shows that the war wasn't just fought on beaches and in fields. It was fought in kitchens and gardens. It was a psychological war. The goal of the Blitz wasn't just to destroy buildings. It was to destroy morale. Studies of civilian populations under bombardment, like those conducted by the British government's Ministry of Information during the war, found that while there was immense fear and anxiety, morale didn't break. People developed a kind of grim resilience. Nella Last's diary is a testament to that. She found a new sense of purpose in her volunteer work in helping others. The small, unimportant housewife became a chronicler of her time. But what about the diaries that weren't collected? How many people wrote down their fears, only for the pages to be lost in the very destruction they described? We know what people told the government and mass observation, but what did they write when they thought no one would ever see it? How much of the psychological toll of the Blitz remains undocumented, buried in the rubble? Number 24. What does a soldier think about before he dies? The Eastern Front was a place of unimaginable brutality. It was a war of annihilation. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, involved millions of men. One of them was Wilhelm Hoffmann. He was a soldier in the German Sixth Army. His unit fought its way across Ukraine and southern Russia. They were heading for a city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. The battle for that city would become one of the turning points of the war. Hoffmann kept a diary. His entries from the early days of the invasion are confident. They are filled with the language of the regime. He talks about victory and destiny, but as the months turn into a year and the fighting gets harder, his tone changes. The confidence cracks. On September 26th, 1942, his unit is in the thick of the fighting in Stalingrad. The battle is for streets, for buildings, for single rooms. He writes about the new reality. He says the old rules of war are gone. He describes the city as a huge furnace. He writes, the men of the Sixth Army are dying from the heat and the smoke. He no longer talks about grand strategy. He talks about finding clean water. He talks about the lice. He talks about the constant noise of shelling and machine gun fire. He writes that every soldier knows they are likely to die. They are doomed army. His entry reveals a complete breakdown of military discipline and ideological belief when faced with the reality of combat. Historians like Antony Beevor, in his book Stalingrad, used diaries like Hoffman's to piece together the soldiers' experience. The official German reports back to Berlin were often misleading. They downplayed the losses and the desperation. But the diaries tell the truth. Hoffman's entry shows a man stripped of his uniform, of his cause. He is just a cold, hungry, terrified human being. He doesn't write about his leaders anymore. He writes about his comrades. He writes about a friend who was killed by a sniper. He writes about wanting to see his family again. The last entry in his diary is dated December 1942. He was one of the roughly 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad in early 1943. Of those, only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany. We don't know if Wilhelm Hoffmann was one of them. His diary survives, but how many didn't? How many soldiers scribbled their last thoughts on a piece of paper, only to have it taken by the enemy or buried with them in a frozen trench? What were the final, unwritten thoughts of the millions who died on the Eastern Front? Did they think of victory or just of a warm bed? Number 23, can you remain human in an inhuman war? The war in the Pacific was different. It was fought on small islands. It was fought in jungles. It was often a war of racial hatred. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, and often without mercy. Eugene B. Sledge was a young man from Alabama who joined the U.S. Marine Corps. He fought in two of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific Campaign, Peleliu and Okinawa. He survived. After the war, he became a biology professor. For years, he couldn't talk about what he had seen. He started writing it down just for himself and his family. Those notes became one of the most famous memoirs of the war, With the Old Breed. His writings are like a diary. They are immediate and unflinching. In a passage about the Battle of Peleliu in September 1944, he describes what the war did to him and his fellow Marines. The battle was supposed to take a few days. It took over 2 months. The heat was suffocating. Water was scarce. The Japanese defenders fought to the last man from a network of caves and tunnels. Sledge writes about the brutalizing effect of the constant combat. He says it stripped away the veneer of civilization. He describes the way Marines would pry gold teeth from the mouths of dead Japanese soldiers. He doesn't judge them. He explains it. He says the enemy was so hated, so dehumanized, that they were no longer seen as men. They were seen as animals, as trophies. He writes with a terrible honesty about his own hatred. He admits that he too enjoyed killing. It was a feeling that scared him then and haunted him for the rest of his life. Sledge's account is a powerful counter-narrative to the heroic war movies. He shows that survival in that kind of environment often required a man to abandon the very morals he was supposed to be fighting for. His writings are supported by the work of historians like John Dower, whose book War Without Mercy details the racial animosity that fueled the Pacific War on both sides. Propaganda posters, both American and Japanese, depicted the enemy as subhuman apes or demons. This made it easier for soldiers like Sledge to do what they had to do. But it left deep psychological scars. The concept of moral injury, where a soldier's actions violate their own ethical code, is now a recognized condition. Sledge was writing about it long before it had a name, but Sledge was a survivor. He had decades to reflect and write. What about the men who didn't come back? What about the diaries of the 1,800 Marines killed on Peleliu or the 14,000 killed on Okinawa? What secrets about the true nature of combat did they take with them? And how many Japanese soldiers kept diaries that documented the same descent into brutality from their perspective, diaries that were then lost or destroyed? Number 22. What does freedom look like from a hidden room? Anne Frank's diary is the most famous diary in the world. It is the story of a young Jewish girl hiding from the German occupation authorities in Amsterdam. She and her family, along with 4 other people, spent 761 days in a secret annex behind a bookcase. Her diary was a gift for her 13th birthday. She wrote to an imaginary friend named Kitty. She filled its pages with the thoughts and feelings of a teenager. She wrote about her frustrations with her mother, her crush on the boy hiding with them, her dreams of becoming a writer. On Tuesday, July 11th, 1944, just a few weeks before she and the others were discovered and arrested, she wrote a particularly revealing entry. She wasn't writing about the war. She was writing about herself. She described having two sides. There was Anne number one, the cheerful, funny, light-hearted girl that she showed to the world. Then there was Anne number two, the deeper, quieter, more thoughtful girl. This was the real Anne, she felt. But she was afraid to show that side to anyone. She was afraid they would laugh at her, that they wouldn't take her seriously. She wrote, "I'm my own best and worst critic. It's a feeling any teenager can understand." But for Anne, it was magnified by her situation. The tiny annex was her entire world. The 7 other people were her only audience. She had nowhere to go to be alone with her thoughts except in the pages of her diary. This entry is so powerful because it reminds us that the victims of persecution were not just victims. They were people. They had complex inner lives. Anne Frank wasn't a saint. She was a normal, complicated teenager. The great tragedy is not just that she was killed, but that this sharp, witty, insightful writer never got the chance to grow up. Her diary has been studied for decades. The Anne Frank House in Amsterdam has conducted extensive research into the diary, authenticating the handwriting and analyzing the different versions she edited herself, hoping to publish it after the war. Her work gives a human face to the statistic of the 6 million Jews murdered during the war. Her story, and the story of the Dutch citizens who risked their lives to help her family, is a testament to both the worst of humanity and the best. But Anne's diary is famous because it survived. How many other diaries were written in hiding places across Europe? How many Anne Franks were there, with their own secret thoughts and dreams, whose stories were silenced forever? What would those lost diaries tell us about the different ways people resisted, survived, and perished in the shadows of occupied Europe? How many helpers were there whose stories were never told? Number 21. How does the city lose its soul? Paris was occupied by German forces in June 1940. For a while, for some people, life went on, but for the city's Jewish population, life began to shrink. The change was gradual. It was a series of laws, of decrees, of small humiliations. Helene Burr was a brilliant young student at the Sorbonne University. She was from a well-to-do, assimilated Jewish family. She started keeping a journal in 1942. At first, it's filled with her life as a student, her love of literature, her friends, her romantic feelings for a young man. But the darkness of the occupation slowly seeps into the pages. On June 8, 1942, she writes about the first day she was forced to wear the yellow star. It was a law imposed by the German authorities and their French collaborators. She describes walking down the street, feeling the stares of other people. Some looked away in shame, some stared with curiosity, some with hatred. A man tipped his hat to her in a gesture of solidarity. A woman on the bus smiled at her. But she writes about the feeling of being marked, of being set apart. She says it's like the brand of Cain, but in reverse. She hasn't done anything wrong. She has been branded for who she is. She writes, "I felt as though I were a target." She describes how the star made the city, her city, feel alien. The familiar streets and parks were no longer hers. Burr's journal, published long after her death as the Journal of Helene Burr, documents the slow, bureaucratic nature of persecution. It wasn't a single violent act at first. It was a process of isolation. This process is well documented by historians like Michael Maris and Robert Paxton in their work Vichy France and the Jews. They detail the series of anti-Jewish statutes, the Statut des Juifs, passed by the collaborationist French government. These laws strip Jews of their rights, their jobs, their property. The yellow star was the visible symbol of that process. Burr's diary shows the human impact of these laws. It shows how a person's identity, their sense of belonging, could be dismantled piece by piece. She continued to write until she was arrested with her parents in March 1944. She was deported to a series of camps and died of typhus just days before the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen camp in 1945. Her journal was saved by a family friend, but it makes you wonder about the internal experiences of millions. How did it feel for a doctor to be told he could no longer practice medicine? For a child to be told they could no longer go to the park? We have the laws and the decrees, but how many written accounts of these daily humiliations were destroyed? What did people tell each other in whispered conversations at night? Conversations that were too dangerous to write down? Number 20. What do you do when your own government is the enemy? We often think of the war in terms of nations against nations, but for many people, the enemy was also at home. Ursula von Kardorf was a German journalist living in Berlin. She came from an aristocratic family and was not a supporter of the ruling party. She moved in circles of people who were critical of the government and its leader. Her diary, published as Berlin in Lights and Shadows, provides a rare glimpse into the lives of dissenting Germans during the war. On July 20th, 1944, she wrote an entry full of frantic energy and whispered hope. It was the day of the famous assassination attempt against the German leader. An officer named Klaus von Stauffenberg had planted a bomb in a briefcase at the leader's military headquarters in East Prussia. For a few hours, it seemed like it might have worked. Von Kardorf writes about the rumors flying around Berlin. She hears that the leader is dead. She hears that a new government is being formed. She writes about the feverish excitement and the unbelievable hope. She and her friends gather talking in hushed tones, daring to dream of the war ending. But then the official news comes. The leader is alive. The coup has failed. Her entry ends with a sense of crushing despair. She writes, "The beautiful dream is over." She knew what was coming next, a brutal crackdown. Her diary entry shows that there was resistance in Germany. It wasn't just a nation of fanatics. There was a small but significant group of people who risked everything to overthrow the regime. The July 20th plot, known as Operation Valkyrie, involved high-ranking military officers and civilians. The failure of the plot led to the arrest of over 7,000 people and the execution of nearly 5,000. Historians like Joachim Fest have written extensively about the German resistance, but diaries like von Kardorf's give us the on-the-ground feeling of that day. They capture the brief flickering hope in a city that was being pounded by Allied bombs and controlled by a totalitarian state. She writes about the dual fear of the bombs from the sky and fear of the secret police on the ground. But von Kardorf was part of an educated elite. What about ordinary Germans? We know that many were true believers in the regime. Many others simply tried to get by. But how much silent dissent was there? How many people kept their thoughts to themselves or wrote them in diaries that they later burned for fear of discovery? What would a diary from a factory worker or a farmer who hated the regime tell us? How many small, unrecorded acts of defiance took place every day? Number 19, can words be a weapon? Victor Klemperer was a professor of literature in the German city of Dresden. He was Jewish, but he was married to a non-Jewish woman and he was a decorated veteran of World War I. These two facts saved him from deportation for a long time. But he was stripped of his job, his home, and his rights. He was forced to live in a Jew's house and do forced labor. He lived in constant fear, but he had a secret project. He kept a diary. In it, he recorded not just the events of his life, but the language of the regime. He believed that the government didn't just conquer with soldiers and police. It conquered with words. It twisted the German language to serve its own ends. In an entry from 1943, he analyzes the word fanatical. He notes how the regime had taken this word, which used to have negative connotations, and turned it into a term of praise. Propaganda constantly talked about fanatical belief and fanatical soldiers. Klemperer writes that the language was designed to eliminate thought. It was a language of slogans, of superlatives, of hatred. It infected everyday speech. He heard it from his neighbors, from the officials he had to deal with. He called his diary his balancing pole. Writing about the language, dissecting it, was his way of holding on to his sanity and his intellectual freedom. It was his private act of resistance. Klemperer's diaries, published after the war as I Will Bear Witness, are a unique and priceless historical document. They show how a totalitarian state seeks to control not just what people do, but what they think. His work is a case study in what the writer George Orwell would later call newspeak. Klemperer wasn't just a victim, he was a scholar, conducting a field study of tyranny from the inside. He and his wife survived the war, in part because they were saved by the chaos of the massive Allied bombing raid on Dresden in February 1945. In the confusion, they were able to remove their yellow stars and escape. His analysis of the regime's language has been hugely influential on scholars studying propaganda and totalitarianism. But Klemperer was a trained linguist. How did ordinary people experience this corruption of their language? Did they notice? Did they care? How many people consciously or unconsciously adopted the new words and phrases? And how did it change the way they saw the world? What would a diary from a less educated person tell us about the power of propaganda to shape reality? Number 18, what does a city eat when there is no food? The siege of Leningrad was one of the longest and most destructive sieges in modern history. For 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944, German and Finnish forces surrounded the city. All supply lines were cut. The city's 3 million inhabitants were trapped. They faced starvation, extreme cold, and constant shelling. The story of the siege is often told in terms of huge numbers. Over 1 million civilians died, but the diary of a young girl named Lena Mukina brings the numbers to life. Lena was 16 when the siege began. Her diary is a brutal, honest account of a city starving to death. In an entry from the winter of 1941, the first and worst winter of the siege, she writes about food. It is all anyone can think about. The daily bread ration had been cut to just 125 grams. It was a small, dense piece of bread made mostly of sawdust and other fillers. Lena writes about the animalistic feeling of hunger. She dreams of food. She writes about people eating wallpaper paste, leather belts, and pets. She describes the silence of the city. A city with no traffic, no birds, just the sound of the wind and the shelling, and the sight of bodies lying in the snow. People were too weak to bury them. She writes about her fear of dying, but she also writes about her determination to live. She studies, she reads, she tries to hold on to some part of her old life. Lena's diary, which was only discovered and published in 2011, is a vital piece of the historical record. It confirms the horrifying accounts of other survivors and historians like Harrison Salisbury, whose book, The 900 Days, was one of the first major English language accounts of the siege. The diary shows the psychological effects of starvation. It breaks down social norms, but it also shows incredible resilience. People in Leningrad continued to go to the library. The symphony orchestra performed. People tried to maintain their humanity in the face of absolute inhumanity. Lena's story has a tragic end. She was evacuated from the city in 1942, but died soon after from the effects of starvation. Her diary was one of many. During the siege, the authorities encouraged people to write, to document the city's struggle. But how many of these diaries were never found? How many people were too weak to write? What were the true unrecorded depths of desperation people reached in order to survive? And what about the soldiers on the other side, the ones enforcing the siege? What did they write in their diaries about the silent, starving city they were trying to conquer? Number 17, who is the enemy in a civil war? Not all the conflicts of the era were between nations. In some countries, the war turned into a brutal civil war, pitting neighbor against neighbor. Greece was one of those places. After being occupied by the Axis powers in 1941, different resistance groups emerged. The two main ones were a communist-led faction and a royalist-led faction. They fought the occupiers, but they also fought each other. After the occupiers were driven out in 1944, the country descended into a full-blown civil war. A Greek doctor named Nicholas Stathakis kept a diary during this period. He was not a committed ideologue for either side. He just wanted to treat the wounded and live in peace. In an entry from December 1944, during a period of intense fighting in Athens known as the Decembriana, he writes about the confusion and the heartbreak of the conflict. He describes treating a young man from the communist resistance in the morning. The boy was barely 18. He had a shrapnel wound in his leg. He talked about his dream of a new fairer Greece. In the afternoon, Stathakis treated a soldier from the opposing government-backed forces, which were supported by the British. This soldier was also young. He also had a shrapnel wound. He talked about his fear of a communist takeover and his desire to protect his country's traditions. Stathakis writes, "They are both Greek. They are both patriots in their own eyes, and they are trying to kill each other in my street." He ends the entry by wondering how his country will ever heal. This diary entry reveals the tragedy of civil war. It's not a clear case of good versus evil. It's a mess of competing loyalties, ideologies, and fears. The Greek Civil War is often a forgotten chapter of the larger global conflict. Historians like Mark Mazauer have explored the complexities of the occupation and resistance in Greece in books like Inside Hitler's Greece. But a personal account like Stathakis' shows the human cost of these political struggles. It shows a professional trying to do his job, to uphold his oath to heal, while his society collapses around him into fratricidal violence. The war had unleashed political forces that could not be contained. How many ordinary people like Dr. Stathakis were caught in the middle of these internal conflicts across Europe and Asia? We have the records of the political and military leaders, but what about the diaries of the villagers, the shopkeepers, the people who were forced to choose a side or risk being killed by both? What did collaboration and resistance really mean to someone whose main goal was just to feed their family? Number 16, can you plan a future in the middle of an air raid? Chieko Sugawara was a young Japanese student living in the city of Sendai during the final year of the war. Japan was facing defeat. American B-29 bombers were systematically destroying its cities with firebombing raids. Food was scarce. The government's propaganda was becoming more and more hysterical, calling for the entire population to fight to the death. In this atmosphere of impending doom, Chieko kept a diary. In an entry from July 1945, she writes about an air raid. The sirens go off. She and her family run to their crude homemade bomb shelter. She describes the sound of the B-29s, which the Japanese called B-san. She writes about the terrifying sound of the incendiary bombs hitting the city, the rain of fire. She can smell the smoke. She can feel the ground shake. She is terrified. But then, in the middle of this description of chaos and fear, she starts to write about her future. She writes about the books she wants to read after the war. She wants to study English literature. She wants to travel. She wants to fall in love. She writes, "I must survive this. There are so many things I still want to do." It is a stunning act of hope in the middle of a firestorm. Chieko's diary, part of a collection published in English as Children of the Abom, offers a crucial perspective. We often see the Japanese population during the war as a monolithic, fanatical mass, but diaries like hers show the reality. They show young people with the same dreams and fears as young people anywhere. She was not a soldier. She was a schoolgirl who was a victim of a war started by her own government. Her writing gives a human face to the civilian side of the air war against Japan. The American strategic bombing campaign, as detailed in studies by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey after the war, was designed to destroy industrial capacity and civilian morale. It killed hundreds of thousands of people. Chieko's diary shows what it was like to be on the receiving end of that strategy. She survived the war, but her story raises questions. How many Japanese civilians privately disagreed with the war, but were too afraid to say so? The military police, the Kempeitai, were notorious for their brutality. How many diaries were kept in secret and then destroyed? What would the diary of a Japanese soldier who had begun to doubt the war tell us? We have very few such accounts, making the picture of Japanese society during the war incomplete. Number 15, how do you say goodbye to a world that is disappearing? The world of the European Jewish communities, especially in Eastern Europe, was a vibrant, centuries-old culture. It was known as the shtetl world. It was a world of Yiddish language, of scholarship, of close-knit communities. The German invasion of Poland in 1939 and the Soviet Union in 1941 marked the beginning of the end for this world. In the city of Warsaw, the Germans created a ghetto, walling off a small section of the city and cramming nearly 500,000 Jews inside. In that ghetto, a historian named Emanuel Ringelblum had an idea. He knew that their world was being destroyed. He feared that the story would be told only by the murderers, so he created a secret archive. He and a group of other writers, scholars, and rabbis began to collect everything they could. Diaries, official documents, poems, drawings, candy wrappers, anything that documented life in the ghetto. They called this secret archive Oineg Shabbos, Joy the Sabbath. One of the most powerful documents in the archive is the diary of an anonymous young boy. In an entry from 1942, as the mass deportations to the death camps began, he writes a simple, heartbreaking farewell. He doesn't write with anger. He writes with a deep, poetic sadness. He describes the empty streets, the abandoned homes. He writes about his memories of holidays, of family dinners, of the life that was gone. He writes, "We are the last. We are the witnesses." The Oineg Shabbos archive is one of the most important historical collections in the world. Ringelblum and his colleagues buried the documents in milk cans and metal boxes, hoping someone would find them after the war. 2 of the 3 caches were recovered from the rubble of Warsaw. The writings, including the young boy's diary, give us an unparalleled view of life and death inside the ghetto. They document the hunger, the disease, the smuggling, the resistance, and the moments of culture and humanity that persisted. Ringelblum and most of his colleagues were killed, but their archive survived. It is a memorial built of paper and ink. But one of the 3 milk cans was never found. What stories does it contain? What final testaments from the Warsaw Ghetto are still buried beneath the modern city? And what about the hundreds of other ghettos across Eastern Europe? What secret archives were started but never finished, their creators and their documents lost forever? Number 14, what is the first thing you do after liberation? For years, people in occupied countries lived under a cloud of fear, scarcity, and oppression. Liberation, when it came, was a moment of explosive joy and relief. The diary of a French woman named Madeleine Blesse gives us a vivid picture of that moment. She was an academic living in the city of Caen in Normandy. She was not Jewish, but she was a foreigner British, born and lived in constant fear of the German occupiers. She endured the D-Day invasion and the brutal Battle of Caen, which destroyed much of the city. On the day the city was finally liberated by Allied troops in July 1944, she writes about the overwhelming emotions. The first thing she notes is the sound. The terrible sound of shelling that had been constant for weeks had finally stopped. The silence was deafening. Then she sees the first Allied soldiers. She describes the feeling of wanting to hug every single one of them. But the most revealing part of her entry is about the small things. She writes about seeing a loaf of white bread for the first time in years. Under the occupation, bread was a dark, coarse ration staple. The sight of white bread symbolized a return to normalcy, to a world without scarcity. She writes about the simple, profound joy of eating a piece of it. It was, she says, the taste of freedom. Blaise's diary, which is held in the archives of the University of Leeds, is a powerful reminder that history is not just about big events like D-Day. It's about how those events affect the daily lives of ordinary people. The liberation of France was a complex process. As historians like William Hitchcock have shown in The Bitter Road to Freedom, it was not always a joyful parade. It was often violent and chaotic. There were shortages, acts of revenge against collaborators, and political uncertainty. But for a woman like Madeleine, on that first day, all that mattered were the simple, tangible signs that the long nightmare was over. A friendly uniform, a piece of white bread. But liberation was different for different people. What did a German civilian write in their diary on the day American or Soviet troops entered their town? Was it a day of liberation or a day of conquest and fear? What did a survivor of a concentration camp write on the day the gates were opened? How can words even begin to describe such an experience? Many survivors reported a feeling of numbness, of unreality. How many of their first fragile thoughts were never written down? Number 13, can you be a tourist in a war zone? Most diaries from the war are about survival, fear, and loss, but some offer a stranger perspective. In 1941, before the United States entered the war, a young American woman named Clara Milburn traveled to the United Kingdom with her British husband. She ended up staying for the entire war, living in a suburb of London. She kept a detailed diary, not as a victim of the war, but as a fascinated and sometimes horrified observer. In an entry from 1942, she writes about going ruin gazing. After a particularly heavy air raid on London, she and her husband would go into the city to look at the damage. She describes it like a form of tourism. She writes about the spectacular sight of a famous church with its roof blown off, open to the sky. She describes the strange, sweet smell of burnt sugar from a destroyed candy factory. She feels a sense of guilt about her fascination. She knows that people died in these places, but she can't help but be drawn to the spectacle. She writes, "It is terrible to say, but it is also terribly exciting." She is an outsider looking in. She is living through history, and she knows it. Clara Milburn's diary, published as Mrs. Milburn's Diaries, gives us a different view of the home front. It shows how even the most terrible events can become normalized, almost a form of entertainment. Her perspective is that of an expatriate, someone who is part of the experience but also slightly removed from it. This sense of detached observation was actually studied during the war. The British Ministry of Information kept detailed records of public morale and noted the strange mix of fear and excitement that bombing raids often produced. People would collect shrapnel as souvenirs. The danger created a sense of adrenaline and community that was missing from their peacetime lives. Milburn's honest admission of her. Terrible excitement gives us a window into that complex psychological state. But her experience was that of a relatively privileged observer. What about the people who weren't just gazing at the ruins, but were buried beneath them? What did the rescue workers, the ARP wardens who had to pull bodies from the rubble, write in their diaries? Their perspective would be far from exciting. How many of these grim, frontline civilian accounts have been lost, seen as too traumatic or too mundane to preserve? And number 12, how do you keep fighting when you know you've lost? By 1945, Germany was defeated. Its cities were in ruins. The Allied armies were closing in from the east and the west. Yet, the German army continued to fight. Why? The diary of a young German officer, Klaus Sellier, gives us some insight. He was fighting on the Western Front, trying to hold back the American advance. He was not a fanatical supporter of the regime. He was a professional soldier who was deeply disillusioned. In an entry from March 1945, just weeks before the end of the war, he writes about the hopelessness of his situation. His unit is out of food, out of ammunition, out of men. He sees young boys, barely teenagers, being sent to the front lines. He calls them cannon fodder. He knows the war is over. He knows that every day it continues means more pointless death. Yet, he keeps fighting. He writes, "We do our duty. What else is there to do?" He says they are not fighting for the leader of the party anymore. They are fighting for each other. They are fighting to protect the man next to them. And they are fighting because to surrender feels like a betrayal of all the comrades who have already died. It's a logic born of exhaustion and despair. Sellier's diary, found on his body after he was killed in action, shows the complex motivations of soldiers on a losing side. It wasn't always ideology that kept them going. It was a mixture of duty, comradeship, fear of what would happen if they surrendered, and a simple lack of any other option. Historians, like Stephen G. Fritz, in his book Endcamp, have studied the final, brutal phase of the war in Germany and have shown how the regime used a combination of propaganda and terror to keep the army and the population fighting to the very end. In diaries, like Sellier's, provide the personal, ground-level view of that policy's effects. He wasn't a monster. He was a tired young man caught in a death machine, but Sellier was an officer. What about the ordinary soldiers? The ones who were less educated, less articulate? What did they think in those final weeks? Did they also think of duty, or did they just think of deserting? The German army executed thousands of its own soldiers for desertion in the final months of the war. How many of their stories, their reasons for running, are lost forever? Word number 11. Can an enemy soldier also be a liberator? The experience of being liberated was not always straightforward. For the inmates of the concentration and death camps scattered across Europe, the arrival of Allied soldiers was a moment of profound, world-altering significance. But what was it like for the soldiers? They were prepared for combat, not for what they found in these camps. And Ed Gosicki was an American soldier who was part of the force that liberated the Dachau concentration camp in April 1945. He kept a journal. His entry from that day is raw and almost incoherent with shock and rage. He writes, "I have seen things today that I will never be able to forget." He describes the skeletal inmates, the living dead. He describes the piles of bodies. He describes the smell. He writes that he and his fellow soldiers, battle-hardened men who had seen combat, wept. They gave the prisoners their own rations, their cigarettes, anything they had. Besides the rage, they found a train full of dead bodies just outside the camp. Some of the American soldiers, in a spontaneous act of fury, executed the remaining camp guards on the spot. Gosicki doesn't justify it. He just records it. He writes, "I don't know if it was right or wrong. I just know that it happened." Gosicki's account is a testament to the horror of the camps and their profound impact on the soldiers who discovered them. These soldiers became unwilling witnesses to a crime that they could barely comprehend. The liberation of the camps was documented by army photographers and journalists, and their reports shocked the world. But the private diaries of the soldiers show the immediate, unfiltered human reaction. They show men pushed beyond the limits of their understanding. The events at Dachau, where guards were killed by both soldiers and inmates, have been a subject of historical study. It was a breakdown of military discipline, but one that is, on a human level, understandable. But what did the survivors write? We have the memoirs of famous survivors like Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi, written years later. But what about the immediate aftermath? What would a diary entry from a prisoner on the day of liberation or the day after tell us? How did they begin to process their freedom and the fact that they had survived when so many had not? How many were too sick, too traumatized, or simply lacked a pencil and paper to record those first moments of a new life? Number 10. What does war do to a child's mind? The war was not just an event for adults. Millions of children lived through it. Their homes were bombed. Their fathers went away to fight. Their schools were closed. They saw things no child should ever see. A project in the United Kingdom during the war asked children to write essays and draw pictures about their experiences. These were not diaries, but they serve the same purpose. They are a window into a child's mind. One anonymous essay, written by a 12-year-old boy from London in 1941, is particularly revealing. He writes about the Blitz, but he doesn't write about being scared. He writes about it as a great adventure. He describes collecting shrapnel from bombs. He and his friends would trade the pieces like baseball cards. The rarer the piece, the more valuable it was. He writes about the thrill of seeing the searchlights in the sky and the anti-aircraft guns firing. He describes the bombed-out houses as great places to play. He knows it's dangerous. He knows people are dying. But his child's mind has processed the horror and turned it into a game. It's a coping mechanism. It's the only way he can make sense of the insane world around him. This boy's essay is a perfect example of what psychologists have studied about children and trauma. Children are incredibly resilient. They can adapt to the most horrific circumstances, but that adaptation can come at a cost. The normalization of violence can have long-lasting effects. The collection of essays and drawings, now held in archives like the Imperial War Museum, shows a wide range of reactions. Some children were clearly terrified and traumatized. Others, like this boy, found a way to make it an adventure. His account reminds us that the home front was a complex place and that even the most terrifying events could be seen through very different eyes. But these were British children. What about the children in Warsaw or Berlin or Tokyo? What games did they invent in the ruins of their cities? We have some collections of children's drawings and writings from these places, but they are much rarer. How did a child's mind process the experience of seeing their own government soldiers as an occupying force? What stories did they tell each other in the bomb shelters of Hamburg or the rubble of Hiroshima? Number 9, can you feel homesick when you're an invader? We often think of soldiers as instruments of war, as cogs in a machine. But they were also just young men, far from home. This was true on all sides. An Italian soldier named Giovanni Messe fought with the German army on the Eastern Front. He was part of an expeditionary force sent by Italy's leader to help his German ally. The Italians were ill-equipped for the brutal Russian winter and were often treated poorly by the Germans. In a diary entry from the winter of 1942 near Stalingrad, Messe doesn't write about combat or strategy. He writes about a lemon. Someone in his unit has received a package from home, and in it is a single, precious lemon. He describes the soldiers gathering around just to smell it. He writes that the smell reminds him of Sicily, of the sun, of a world without snow and death. He says, the scent is more powerful than a memory. It's a physical link to the home he is not sure he will ever see again. The soldiers cut the lemon into tiny pieces, and each man gets a small slice to suck on. For a few moments, they are not soldiers in a foreign land. They are boys back in their village. The entry is a small, poignant moment of humanity in the middle of the war's most brutal theater. This entry shows the universal experience of the soldier homesickness. It cuts across all nationalities. This Messe's experience highlights the often forgotten role of other Axis powers on the Eastern Front. The Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian armies that fought alongside the Germans suffered enormous losses. Their story is often overshadowed by the German-Soviet conflict, but diaries like this remind us that every army was made up of individuals, each with their own memories and longings. The sensory detail of the lemon is what makes the entry so powerful. It's a detail that would never appear in an official report, but it tells you more about the morale of the Italian army than any statistic. But this is the diary of a soldier who survived to become a general and write his memoirs. What about the ordinary Italian soldiers, the ones who froze to death on the retreat from the Don River in the winter of 1942 to 43? What were their last thoughts of home? How many scribbled letters and diary entries were lost in the snow? Their small stories of lemons and sunshine vanishing from history. Number 8. What is the sound of a country being torn apart? Yugoslavia was a complex country of multiple ethnic and religious groups. When it was invaded and dismembered by the Axis powers in 1941, these tensions exploded. The war in Yugoslavia was not one war, but many. It was a war against the occupiers. It was a civil war between different resistance groups, primarily the communist-led partisans and the Serbian nationalist Chetniks. And it was a genocidal war, particularly one waged by the Croatian fascist Ustaše regime against Serbs, Jews, and Roma. A Serbian schoolteacher named Mihajlo Petrović kept a diary in his small village. His village was in a region contested by all sides. His diary is not about battles, it's about fear and suspicion. In an entry from 1943, he writes about the night. He says that the day belongs to whoever's patrol is passing through. It might be Germans, it might be Ustache, it might be partisans. You smile and nod and try to survive, but the night, he writes, belongs to no one. It belongs to the men with knives. He writes about the sounds. A dog barking when it shouldn't. A scream cut short. A door being kicked in. He doesn't know who is killing whom. Is it the Ustache killing a Serb family? Is it the partisans executing a suspected collaborator? Is it a personal feud being settled under the cover of war? He writes, "We do not look our neighbors in the eye anymore. We do not know who to trust." Petrovich's diary captures the essence of the war in Yugoslavia, its intimate, village-level brutality. This was a war where your neighbor could be your executioner. Historians like Jozo Tomasevic have meticulously documented the political and military complexities of the war in Yugoslavia, but personal accounts like this show the psychological impact on the population. The breakdown of social trust is one of the deepest wounds of a civil war. Petrovic's fear is not of a bomb from the sky, but of a knock on the door. It's the fear of the familiar being twisted into something monstrous. But Petrovic was a Serb. What would the diary of a Croat in a neighboring village say? Or a Bosnian Muslim caught between the two? The history of this conflict is still hotly debated, with each group having its own narrative of victimhood and heroism. How many personal diaries from this period exist but are kept hidden, considered too politically dangerous to reveal even decades later? What truths about the cycle of violence are locked away in family attics across the former Yugoslavia? Number 7. Can you be free and still be in a cage? When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it unleashed a wave of fear and paranoia in the United States, especially on the West Coast. The U.S. government, in an act that is now widely seen as a gross violation of civil rights, ordered the internment of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry. 2/3 of them were American citizens. They were forced from their homes and sent to relocation centers, essentially concentration camps in remote parts of the country. One of the people interned was a young Japanese-American woman named Mine Okubo. She was an artist. She and her brother were sent to a camp in Topaz, Utah. She decided to document everything she saw. She made hundreds of sketches and kept a journal. Her writings and drawings were later published in a book called Citizen 13,660, her assigned family number. In one entry, she describes the absurdity of their situation. She writes about the camp being surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Yet, inside the camp, they try to create a semblance of American life. They have schools, they have dances, they have a newspaper. On the 4th of July, they pledge allegiance to the flag of the country that has imprisoned them. She writes, "We were Americans and we were determined to act like it." The entry is not filled with rage, it's filled with a sense of bitter irony. Okubo's work is a crucial document of this shameful episode in American history. It provides a visual and written record of daily life in the camps. It shows the resilience and dignity of the people who were interned. The U.S. government's own reports from the War Relocation Authority provide the official side of the story, but Okubo's work provides the human side. Her clear, simple prose and line drawings capture the dehumanizing bureaucracy of the process and the small ways people resisted it by trying to maintain their identity and culture. But Okubo was an artist, a keen observer. What about the others? What did the elderly Issei, the first-generation immigrants who lost their businesses and farms, write about? What did the Nisei soldiers, the second-generation citizens who volunteered to fight for the U.S. in Europe in the famed 442nd Regimental Combat Team, write in their diaries about the irony of fighting for a country that had locked up their families? How many of these stories, written in both Japanese and English, have yet to be uncovered and told? Number 6, when everyone is lying, how do you find the truth? Joseph Goebbels was the minister of propaganda for the German regime. He was one of the most powerful men in the government and a fanatical follower of its leader. He was also a compulsive diarist. He kept a detailed diary for most of his adult life. The surviving portions from the war years run to thousands of pages. They are a unique and chilling historical document. In an entry from February 1943, in the aftermath of the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, he describes his efforts to manage public opinion. He admits in his diary that the situation is a disaster. He knows the war in the East is going badly. But in public, his job is to project confidence and strength. He writes about a major speech he is about to give at the Berlin Sport Blast. This would become the infamous Total War speech. He meticulously plans his performance. He writes about the need to electrify the masses, to whip them into a frenzy. He sees the German people not as citizens to be informed, but as an instrument to be played. He is a master of manipulation, and he is proud of it. The diary entry is a cold, calculating look into the mind of a propagandist. There is no empathy. There is only the goal to control the narrative, no matter what the truth is. Goebbels' diaries are an invaluable resource for historians. Because he was in the inner circle, he provides a day-by-day account of the high-level decision-making of the regime. But unlike official documents, the diary also reveals his personal thoughts, his rivalries, his vanity, and his absolute cynicism. When you read his diary alongside a diary from an ordinary German like Ursula von Kardorf, you see the massive gap between the reality the leaders were creating and the reality the people were living. His writings, expertly, analyzed by historians like Peter Longrich, show that propaganda isn't just about lying, it's about creating an entire alternative reality. But Goebbels' diary is the ultimate insider account. It's self-serving and deeply biased. The most shocking question it raises is not about what's in it, but what isn't. What conversations happened that even he was afraid to write down? What were the real, unspoken fears of the regime's leaders as they saw their world collapsing? And how many low-level officials, the ones who had to carry out the horrific orders, kept secret diaries that contradicted the official story, diaries that were burned in the final days of the war? Number 5. Where do you find beauty when the world is ugly? The war was a time of destruction and brutality. But even in the darkest corners, people found ways to create and appreciate beauty. Etty Hillesum was a young Jewish woman living in Amsterdam. She was a complex, intellectual, and deeply spiritual person. As the persecution of Jews in the Netherlands intensified, she began to keep a diary. It is not just a record of events. It is a record of her inner journey. She eventually volunteered to work at the Westerbork transit camp in the Netherlands, a place where Jews were held before being deported to the death camps in the East. She wanted to be a thinking heart in the middle of the horror. In an entry from 1943 written from inside Westerbork, she doesn't write about the horror. She writes about the sky. She looks up past the barbed wire and the watchtowers. She sees the clouds and the vastness of the sky. She writes, "The sky is full of God." She finds a sense of peace and beauty in that simple act of looking up. She refuses to hate her persecutors. She believes that the only way to fight the ugliness in the world is to cultivate the beauty within oneself. She writes that she wants to be like a balsam on the wounds of others. Her diary is a testament to the power of the human spirit to find meaning and even joy in the most unimaginable circumstances. She was deported to Auschwitz in September 1943 and murdered. Etty Hillesum's diary, published as An Interrupted Life, has been compared to the work of Anne Frank and Victor Klemperer. It is a profound work of philosophy and spirituality, written not in a quiet study, but in the antechamber to hell. It challenges our assumptions about how people should react to suffering. She did not engage in physical resistance. Her resistance was internal. It was the refusal to let the hatred of others poison her own soul. Her writings are a powerful example of what is sometimes called spiritual resistance. But Etty was a highly educated and articulate woman. What about the others in the camps? How did ordinary, less educated people find meaning and beauty? Did they sing songs, tell stories, share a secret piece of bread? These small, unrecorded acts of spiritual resistance are almost entirely lost to history. And how many Etty Hillesums were there whose thoughts were never written down, whose private struggles to remain human were known only to themselves? Number 4, how does it feel to drop a bomb on a city? We have many diaries from people who lived under bombardment. We have far fewer from the men who were dropping the bombs. Howard Zinn was a young American bombardier on a B-17 bomber flying missions over Europe. After the war, he became a famous historian and peace activist. His wartime experiences shaped his entire worldview. He kept a journal during the war. In an entry from 1945, he describes a mission to bomb the French town of Royan. The war in Europe was almost over. The German soldiers in Royan were isolated and ready to surrender. But the order came down to bomb the town using a new weapon, napalm. Zinn writes about the mission in a detached, professional way. He describes the procedure of the bombing run, the toggling of the switches, the release of the bombs. But then he writes about the feeling afterward, a feeling of unease, a feeling that something was wrong. He had been told he was bombing German soldiers. He later learned that they had also killed hundreds, perhaps thousands, of French civilians. He was a liberator, but he had brought death and destruction to the very people he was supposed to be helping. This mission haunted him for the rest of his life. He wrote, "I was a bombardier. I dropped bombs. It was a job. But what was I really doing?" Zinn's journal and later writings are a powerful critique of the morality of aerial bombing. He forces us to look at the war not just from the perspective of the victims on the ground, but from the perspective of the men in the air. These were not evil men. They were young, trained to do a job, and they believed they were fighting for a just cause. But the technology of aerial warfare created a huge distance between the act and its consequences. As Zinn points out, it's much easier to pull a lever at 30,000 feet than it is to kill someone face to face. His experience is a case study in what Hannah Arendt would later call the banality of evil, where terrible acts are carried out not through hatred, but through a kind of thoughtless, bureaucratic efficiency. But Zinn became a famous intellectual. He had the tools to analyze and write about his experience. What about the other thousands of airmen? How did they process what they had done? Did they write about it in their diaries, or was it something they tried to forget? What would the journal of a British bomber pilot from Bomber Command, who had to participate in the firebombing of German cities, tell us about the psychological toll of that campaign? How many of these men suffered in silence for the rest of their lives? Number 3. What do you say to a son you'll never see grow up? For a soldier, the fear of death is constant, but it's not just the fear of their own life ending, it's the fear of leaving their loved ones behind. It's the fear of their children growing up without them. In 1941, an American officer named Sullivan Ballou wrote a famous, beautiful letter to his wife before the Battle of Bull Run in the Civil War. That tradition of writing a final letter or diary entry, a message in a bottle to the future, continued in World War II. A French resistance fighter named Henri Fertet was captured by the Germans in 1943. He was just 16 years old. He was tortured and sentenced to death. On the morning of his execution, he was allowed to write a final letter to his parents. This letter is, in effect, his final diary entry. It is a message from the edge of the grave. He writes with a calmness and maturity that is stunning for a 16-year-old. He tells his parents not to be sad. He says he has no regrets. He writes, "I am going to die for my country." He gives them instructions. He tells his little brother to study hard. He tells his mother to be brave. And at the end, he writes a line that is almost unbearable to read. "1,000 kisses, long live France." He is a child trying to comfort his parents about his own death. This letter is one of the most powerful documents of the French resistance. It shows the incredible courage and idealism of many of its members. Henri Fertet was not a general or a politician. He was a schoolboy who made a choice to fight against the occupation of his country, and he paid the ultimate price. His letter gives a face to the statistics of the resistance, the thousands of young men and women who were executed or died in combat. It is a reminder that the fight for freedom is often waged by the very young. Henri's letter survived. It became a symbol of sacrifice in France. But how many such letters were written and never delivered? How many soldiers on all sides scribbled a final note to a wife, a parent, or a child, only to have it lost on the battlefield? What final words of love, regret, or hope are lying undiscovered in the pockets of old uniforms and military archives around the world? What unread goodbyes are still waiting to be heard? Number 2, can you prepare for the end of the world? On August 6, 1945, the world changed forever. An American B-29 bomber dropped a single atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The war ended. The nuclear age began. We have the accounts of the American pilots. We have the reports of the scientists, but what was it like to be on the ground? Michihiko Hachiya was a doctor who ran a hospital in Hiroshima. He was at home, not far from the center of the city, when the bomb exploded. He was badly wounded, but he survived. He made his way to his hospital and began to treat the injured. For the next several weeks, he kept a diary, documenting what he saw. It is a clinical, precise, and utterly terrifying account of the aftermath of a nuclear explosion. In an entry from the first day, he describes the city as a red-brown scar. He writes about the shadows burned onto walls where people had been standing. He describes the strange new illness that began to affect the survivors. People who seemed to be uninjured would suddenly develop a high fever, their hair would fall out, and they would bleed from their gums. They would die in agony. It was radiation sickness. No one knew what it was. Hachiya, a trained doctor, was helpless. He was a scientist witnessing a phenomenon that was outside of all known medical science. His diary is not emotional. It is the work of a stunned observer trying to make sense of something that is incomprehensible. He is documenting the end of his world. Dr. Hachiya's diary, published as Hiroshima Diary, is one of the most important first-hand accounts of the atomic bombing. It is a sober, scientific look at the human cost of this new weapon. It stands as a permanent warning. Along with the testimonies of other survivors known as hibakusha, it provides the crucial human perspective that is often missing from the high-level political and military discussions about the decision to use the bomb. His detailed medical observations were among the first records of the effects of acute radiation syndrome on a large population. But Dr. Hachiya was a doctor. His diary is focused on the physical effects. What about the psychological effects? What would the diary of a mother who lost her children in the blast tell us? What did people write about in the days and weeks after the bombing as they tried to rebuild their lives in a radioactive city? How many diaries were simply vaporized in the initial blast, their stories turned to ash in an instant? What are the unrecorded memories of the hibakusha who were too traumatized or too young to ever write their stories down? Number one, what does a blank page in a diary mean? Perhaps the most revealing diary entries are the ones that are not there. The blank pages, the sudden end of a story. We have been reading the words of people who lived through the war, but the final, most profound story is the one told by silence. There are thousands of diaries in archives around the world that end abruptly. A soldier writes about the night before a big attack. He is scared, he misses his wife, he hopes he will survive. The next page is blank. A woman in a ghetto writes about the rumors of a coming wrestlement. She is packing her small suitcase. She doesn't know where she is going. The diary ends there. A civilian in a city under siege writes about the dwindling food supplies. He is getting weaker. It is getting harder to hold the pen. And then nothing. Consider the diary of the anonymous boy from the Warsaw Ghetto, the one from the Oyneg Shabbos archive. His last entry is a beautiful, sad poem about a flower growing in the rubble. And then the diary stops. We don't know his name. We don't know what happened to him. We only know that he was one of the 300,000 people deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka death camp in the summer of 1942. The blank page after his last entry is more powerful than any words. It is a void. It is the physical presence of an absence. It represents a life cut short, a story that was not allowed to have an end. This silence is the final unanswerable truth of the war. For every diary we have, there are thousands that were lost, destroyed, or never written. The historical record is full of holes. These blank pages represent the 75 million people who died. Each one of them had a story. Each one of them had an inner life, a set of memories, hopes, and fears. We can study the battles, the politics, the economics of the war, but we can never fully know the human cost. The diaries we have are like tiny pinpricks of light in a vast darkness. They are precious because they give us a glimpse into that darkness. But they also remind us of how much we will never know. What was the last thought of the soldier whose diary ends mid-sentence? What was the last thing the woman in the ghetto saw before her diary was taken from her? The final, most shocking question is not what is written in the diaries of the Second World War. It's what is contained in the silence of their final empty pages. And what does it mean for us, the living, to be the custodians of so many unfinished stories?